Hello everyone, welcome for me again. My name is Kirchmaier. I'm Director of Policing and Crime at the Center for Economic Performance of the London School of Economics. Today's lecture is about gangs, drugs and knife crime in London. And it's a paper together with Steve Machin and Carmen Villa. Now, the reason why we're here, everybody knows knife crime is a huge problem, was a very big problem before the lockdown, and might actually come back to haunt us again once the lockdown ends, and one day it will end. Just to give us a bit of a perspective about where we are, this is a long-term trend from 1990 till today. The black line are the homicides. The blue dotted line, which then goes up here, is knife crime, and robberies is this white dotted black line. So what we see is homicides have been falling quite dramatically for a long period of time. Then they came up and got stopped, whereas knife crime still goes up quite dramatically. The data is from the ONS. So it's for England and Wales. And just looking at murders, as we see, it's an even more dramatic picture, where here from about 2015 onwards, so 2016, 17, 18, it explodes quite dramatically. But what's interesting is these are all male on male murders, and female on female or male on female is actually quite small. So, there's a slight uptake. And this is interesting because if you go back to the 1970s, the picture was actually much more balanced in a negative point of view, i.e. you had many more murders of women than you have now. So I can't tell you what happened in the 70s. It's just a fact that it kind of fell dramatically and is now male to male only, essentially. Good. Knife crime rates. So where's the problem? It's mainly a London problem. Then the Northwest, Yorkshire, West Mids, East Mids. But you see the level, and this is normalized by population. London is about double what it is in the Northwest. And here you see knife crimes in London, and this is important. So this is public data that comes from the dashboard, the data dashboard of the Met. And it's also important how we show this data, because it's quite noisy. And so we show you the individual data point per month, and then a regression line. This is the lowest regression. The beauty is you actually get a nice trend line in quite noisy data. And you see towards the end, so this includes until March 2020, the March number fell quite dramatically, also probably because we were already in lockdown. But overall, knife crime seems to have stabilized on a new plateau. When you look at knife crime with injury, it's actually a very positive picture. While it's been going up there until the end of 2017, since then the trend has been falling, and falling quite dramatically, going back to the level where it was actually in 2013. And this is a real success story. So whatever the Met did, I think it worked, and something we can actually be proud of. Now look at murders. Murders are actually very stable. The issue is the levels are very small, and you see the data is really noisy. So it is also kind of has reached a plateau as knife crimes overall. The issue with murders is that it is very hard to predict which knife crime with injury leads to a murder charge, and so and also if you just compare the levels, so here you have 10 to 15 per month, and here you had 13 to 400, 300 to 400 per month. So it's quite dramatic change. Good. What do we know about gangs and knife crime? The victims are mainly male and young. And when you talk to these gang members, they have to believe that they need protection, which then leads them to carry knives, which then leads them to commit a knife crime. And so we are in this vicious circle out of which we have to break out. Why are gangs attractive? You know, they're a role model for young children in certain areas, and I'll show you later. They're often from deprived areas, lone families, single mother families, and so on. And people think this is very easy money. And what I show you in this paper is that knife crime and gang activity are highly correlated, which means that if we want to solve the knife crime problem, we probably have to also think about how to address the gang problem in London and beyond, to that matter. And so my theory is that in part this was driven by changes in economic conditions, austerity, but also changes in the drug market dynamics that, as I said in the intro, what we see is a switch of consumers to the online drug market, which means that the market for drugs on the streets of London and beyond is shrinking. But more about that later. Good. What do we know about the drug markets? So things have changed quite dramatically. On the left, you see austerity. So youth services and so on were cut very dramatically. So these youngsters at times don't know what to do with it. And on the right, you see actually in log scale just Bitcoin transaction. So we see that the Darknet market, although Bitcoins are also used for other purposes, is actually growing exponentially. At the same time, quite a few changes on the supplier side. So all the drugs are coming essentially from Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru. Colombia has had a peace deal, which meant actually the supply of cocaine from Colombia is growing quite dramatically. And you see this here from 2009, the purity actually on the streets went up, and in fact, more than doubled, if not probably almost tripled if you see it today. So the quality of the drugs on the streets of London plus online improved. They got much stronger, simply because you have the supply push out of Colombia. Now, how does COVID affect us? That's an interesting question on which we can only speculate. But what we know is with the supply routes via air and ship drying up, because all global trade is drying up, you can expect that there is enormous supply glut building up in the producer countries. So when the lockdown will be released and trade starts again, planes start flying again, what you will see is probably an enormous push of very cheap, very strong drugs into the markets in Europe and North America, which will have its very own problems, which also probably means that gangs will try very hard to restore their old market, and territory might actually start fighting very, very dramatically again. So county lines is another feature. Here you see the picture out of London, which is mainly kind of going to the southwest, southeast, a little bit into the southern parts of Wales, and then up to Essex or Kent. A little bit to Scotland, the other supply route is coming out of Liverpool and Manchester on the northwest, which we don't see here. But more about that in a second. So this is the argument I'm making. What I show you here is survey data from the Global Drug Survey. Now, survey data is always noisy, but it gives you some form of indication about how the market is moving. And the solid black line, which you see here, is the fraction of users of drugs who said they purchased their drugs online. And here you see quite a dramatic switch starting in 2016 and then going up 2017. So in a very short period of time, the market share, the online market share, doubled from about 12.5% to 25%, and is now stable since. All the other countries are much, much lower. New Zealand the lowest, simply because it's far away in a small community and probably has other means. The point I'm trying to make is because you had this dramatic shift to the online drug market, the market for drugs on the streets of London and actually beyond was shrinking quite dramatically. And so what do you do if you have a shock to your demand? You start to actually fill up, because these gangs have also fixed costs. You start to compensate it by fighting for territory and delivering, developing new markets. So you fight for territories using knives and so on. And, as I've shown you here on the slide before, you develop new markets in terms of county lines. Now, it's true that county lines carry different drugs than what you see in the streets of London, but I think that doesn't really matter, because if you're a supplier, you supply what people want to buy. So you just react to market signals. Now, this is data that just came out very recently about the Darknet. It's a paper coming out of Europe on the market for drugs during lockdown. And what you see is the Darknet is still really important. And in fact, half the suppliers that we find in some of these Darknet platforms come out of the UK, about 30% come out of Germany, and the rest of Europe and a few worldwide. Now, a word of caution about these Darknet market scrapes. So the very big platforms don't allow you to scrape data anymore, which makes it a bit uncomparable. Having said that, what we see is get a glimpse from some of the smaller marketplaces, and it still gives you a good idea, or at least indication, about what you see more generally. So another survey here about ease of obtaining drugs in 24 hours if wanting to obtain, and again, the supply is becoming more efficient. It's really easy for drug users to get drugs if they want to. Now here, this is a data from Mirko Drucker, Steve Machen, and RA, which scraped the Darknet and scraped all platforms and have the data of the population of all transactions. And what you see is the prices that were quoted there. The black line is price for delivery in the US, and the red line is the one for delivery in the UK. And you see that the two markets are actually nicely converging, which means the market in the UK became much more liquid and much cheaper, therefore, than in the EU, and converged actually with the US. The US was probably always very liquid because it has a stable price. And what you then observe is Oh, well, the conclusion I draw is actually that the market for drugs online in the UK became very efficient, which also explains this switch of consumers to it, because probably they get the drugs cheaper, better, faster, and safer than if you have to buy it online. Because remember, drugs come through the letterbox if you buy them online, and so it's a pretty safe form of delivery. Good. So now I'll show you some data. After all, we are data people. Don't be scared when I show you some regression analysis. I will explain what that means. Good. The data comes from the crime dashboard, from the Met. We also have some offender data from Thames Valley Police, which is actually very interesting, and more about that later. Socioeconomic indicators from the ONS, points of interest data from Ordnance Survey. We have a gangs map by Ian Aga, which is very interesting. We have the Mayor's Moparks crime survey, the overall crime survey for England and Wales, and the booth maps of income levels in 1889, which gives us a very good handle on persistence of poverty in London. So in summary, a very wide area of data which we are exploiting here. Here, this is kind of, actually this map comes from Ian, a gang map and how it evolved. And so what you see is actually kind of 1995, 2000, a good 20 years ago, the gangs operated in inner London, South London, a little bit to the east, but then got pushed out further south, further east, and further north, once London became richer and probably gentrified. And the quote above I find quite revealing, because it gives us a good glimpse where the problem is. It says nobody steps on our home or your turf without your permission. So they defend their territory very, very strongly, and it's good. So here, the picture you see in color is the Charles Booth map of 1889. So Charles Booth walked the streets of London more than 100 years ago and categorized each street by socioeconomic categories that go from upper class to very poor or semi-criminal. What's interesting is also we overlaid it with the gang areas from today, and what you see is the poor areas in 1889 in part explain the gang areas in 2018, 2020. So where do these gangs get formed? This is just in support of what I just said. So the poorest areas in 1889 show us where gangs operate today, with loads of controls. So this is the poverty which you saw back then. And here are the socioeconomic indicators from today. The percent of social housing today is highly correlated probably with the poverty from back then. Unemployment rate today, it's the same. Income, immigration is actually negatively correlated with gang areas, and higher education also, which doesn't come as much of a surprise. So the same here on the right is, you see with for fixed effects, so area fixed effects, which just mean we control for many other variables, unobserved heterogeneity, but all our indicators are stable. That means the results are robust. Good. Where do they form? And where did the form of the last 10 years is if unemployment goes up, or actually here we show the level and the change. So where we had a high level of unemployment in 2001 explains gang formation in the 2 decades that followed, and the change in unemployment rate between 2010 and between 2001 and 2010. So unemployment here, migration does help in terms of negatively explains gang formation, not necessarily gangs areas, as I have told you before. And again, social housing, high level of education means low level of gang formation, which is also not overly interesting, overly surprising. So what I show you here is now a map of hotspots and cold spots. Now, everybody in policing talks about hotspots, nobody talks about cold spots. And if I could make a suggestion here, I think that's already quite interesting to have a look at and to consider, because we always look at the areas where things should be, but not where they shouldn't be. So, you want to, anyway, for completeness, you want to have the other side of the coin, but also I think it should inform you where you really don't want to go and where you don't want to deploy resources. Good. And so the last bit is really interesting. So the non-gang areas today were also the richest areas more than 100 years ago. And overall, this is quite interesting. The rich areas in 1889, when Charles Booth walked the streets of London, are still the richest today. From when you look at the poorer ones, and especially the poorest, half of them are still as poor as back then, and half actually became richer and probably got gentrified. And this is just a map here to the left that shows you that the cold spots and the hot spots, as I said, something we should consider in policing to look at in more generally. Gangs and crimes. So here we want to show that actually gangs cause crime. The important bit is here the gang dynamic that explains weapons, violence against a person, drugs, antisocial behavior, burglary, robbery, public order. All of them actually explain, so the gangs explain higher crime levels across the board. And we're controlling for all sorts of socioeconomic indicators. So it is really the gangs that drive these higher levels. So it's clearly about knife crime here, but more generally, we should think that we probably could pacify some of the areas by becoming a bit tougher on these gangs and the underlying cause. Good. So what's the dynamics of these gangs as we know it? So the large gangs become larger, a bit like in the economy. The larger firms become larger. The smaller groups become satellites. And the more complex and better organized gangs are also running these county lines. And the interesting bit is when we looked at the data from Thames Valley and the people they arrested there for county line offences and drug offences, when they came from outside, they came from a very small area in London, which was one of the more violent gangs in London. So we don't have data from other forces yet, but my gut feeling is that a certain degree of specialization, one gang then just delivers into one area. And so that also into one area outside London, but that also means that if you want to solve a county line problem somewhere in Thames Valley or any of the other forces, you probably have to go back to the source of the violence, which is a gang in London, and try to do something about it there. So right to buy means just when Maggie Thatcher back then introduced the right to buy or council flats. When that happened, that had a positive impact on crime levels than today. So this is just a bit of math which we want to show you. And the important thing is the bit here on the right that shows you, this is an instrumental verbal regression, that actually the number of gangs in an area determine the knife crime rate causally. And that's important. So the gangs cause knife crime, which we can show here. It's super significant statistically, and economically it's about 16%, but in other specification it goes up to about 30%. So gangs cause knife crime, and that's, I think, a very important insight here. The Met, together with the NCA, ran an operation to take out the Thatch House tax gang. That was July, October 2017. This is all public data, so nothing secret here. Here you see a map and how they had operated, and then the operation went from July to October, and we see that actually overall gangs, as I said, has a positive impact on all areas other than bicycle theft, which is fair enough. Then the operation happened, so knife crime with injury went down. This is during the operation. Arson went down, criminal damage went down quite considerably, and drugs went up because clearly they found some drugs. But the interesting bit is now, this is in the period after 2017, knife crime with injury persistently stayed low. Knife crime overall stayed low, arson stayed low. So, and this is something we have to think about, kind of taking out some of these gangs might actually have a very long-term positive effect on the crime levels in a particular area. So this is now survey data from Mopac, and where we had knife crimes and murders. These are actually murder points in London over the last few years. We also have this as a website if somebody is interested. We can send it to you. Again, public data, the murders coming from news sources, and Mopac is survey data that they have openly available. What is interesting is that if you ask, especially young black males, about what they think of knife crime, it is a very good predictor about what will happen the following year in terms of murders on the streets of London. So these people know, they're scared, they voice it, and then you have an increase in that particular area. And here we have three different specifications. One is old. So the question is, do you think drug trafficking is a problem in your area? And it actually also works with similar questions that are asked in that survey. So do you think drug trafficking is a problem? You take all respondents, very strongly significant, predictor for knife crime the following year, because this is lagged. Equally strong for if you just ask the youngsters, and if you ask the adults, it's a bit weaker. Nevertheless, this is a really important insight. The youngsters or the people on the streets of London know where the problem is, and they're concerned, predict knife crime. And here's murder. And here's my knife crime, but it also predicts murders the following year. And we were able to have a model where we bring all these things together that predicts quite well the problem areas the following year. Good. So what did we learn? Gangs form in areas with high level of deprivation, high percentage of lone parents, high levels of social housing, all indicators of poverty. The poverty is extremely persistent, as I showed you. Poverty in 1898 could explain poverty today, but also knife crime activity and gangs activity today. Gangs have a positive effect in terms of more gangs means more knife crime. So an additional gang in an area increases knife crime between 15 to about 35%. And as always, the problem is a bit more difficult, and that's my personal opinion. In part, this is being explained by changes in the drug market, where consumers switch to buying drugs online, meaning the drugs on the streets of London are shrinking. So this is it for me for today. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.